In the hills of Appalachia, where the mountains fold in on themselves like secrets unwilling to be told, there is one story whispered so faintly that even time itself seems ashamed to remember it. It begins not with a dynasty of kings or an empire of gold, but with a woman, a single woman, bound by blood, hunger, and silence. Her name is barely spoken now, erased in half-burned family Bibles and forgotten grave markers swallowed by moss, but those who recall her do not remember her as a wife or even as a mother. They remember her as something far darker, for this was the woman who took 3 husbands, not across a lifetime, but within a single twisted circle of kin, brothers, cousins, blood so close it should never have touched. And yet, it did, again and again. The mountains kept her story hidden, wrapping it in the illusion of isolation, where poverty gave no room for choice and survival blurred the line between love and necessity. They say she was beautiful once, but beauty rotted fast in the hollows, where teeth decayed before 20 and skin leathered under labor and malnutrition. What lingered was not beauty, but desperation, the kind that drives a person to do what others would not even imagine. Her bed was not one of romance. It was a grave of bloodlines, stitched together until the stitching itself began to unravel. Children were born, though not all lived. The ones who did carried faces that made neighbors look twice, then look away. Eyes too close, jaws uneven, features warped in subtle ways that spoke of things no preacher dared mention aloud. There are fragments of her story found in courthouse records, in whispers scratched on the backs of census pages, in the gossip of old mountain families who swore they weren't related, but secretly feared they were, and every piece leads back to that same cold bed, a bed where 3 men laid and 1 woman endured, bound by something stronger than love, heavier than sin. For her choices, or perhaps her lack of them, would set in motion a chain of lives that carried the mark of her unions for generations. This is not just the story of a woman, it is the story of an entire lineage trapped in the web she spun, whether by force, by fate, or by the cruel hand of hunger. And once you hear it in full, you'll never see Appalachia the same way again. The mountains of Appalachia do not give up their ghosts easily. They bury them in soil as red as blood, beneath crooked tombstones, behind clapboard houses where the wood itself seems to rot from secrets. To understand the woman at the heart of this story, you must first understand the land that shaped her. It was the early 1900s, when industry was creeping into the hills, coal towns rising like fever dreams, swallowing men whole, spitting them back out black-lunged and broken. But beyond the reach of those mines, deep in the hollows, families clung to survival by the thinnest thread. They lived in one-room shacks, sometimes without floors, their beds crawling with lice, their pantries empty but for cornmeal and lard. It was here that she was born. A daughter to a family already fraying at the edges. Records of her childhood are scarce, but the oral histories say her mother bore too many children, too close together, her body breaking under the weight of poverty. Her father drank when he could afford to, and when he couldn't, he broke the silence of the night with rage instead. In that world, a girl was not raised to dream. She was raised to endure, to keep the house running, to fetch water, to care for siblings until her own body was considered ripe enough for marriage. Marriage in these mountains was rarely a union of choice. It was survival, 2 names joined not for love, but for the pooling of meager resources. But when the pool was shallow, when neighbors were scarce, when distance and hunger closed in, marriages began to circle back into the family tree. Cousins wed cousins, brothers passed down widows as though they were land or cattle. No preacher could bless it, yet it happened all the same. And it was within this suffocating circle that she found herself, her fate tied to men whose faces bore her own blood. The first husband was little more than a boy, though, he wore the title of man. He was her cousin, older by only a few years, and their union was marked not by ceremony, but by the quiet acknowledgement of families who needed one less mouth to feed. It was said that her eyes did not meet his as they lay together the first night, but stared instead at the cracks in the ceiling, as though the wood itself would offer her escape. Escape never came. What followed was a slow entanglement, a weaving of bloodlines into knots too tight to undo. And when the first husband was gone, whether by sickness, by accident, or by the silent erasure of poverty's many cruelties, the woman did not leave that bed cold. Another man stepped in, and then another, each one closer in blood than the last, until the distinction between husband and kin dissolved completely. What she endured, what she allowed, and what she birthed in that darkness would become the legacy of her name, even if the world forgot to write it down. Her second husband was not chosen by affection, nor by any courtship that could be called such. He was her husband because he was there, because her family needed the arrangement to keep them afloat, and because in the cruel arithmetic of mountain life she had no voice to protest. This man was her cousin too, closer than the first, their blood thicker, their lineage tied tighter by fewer branches. To outsiders, such unions might have seemed unthinkable, but outsiders rarely survived long in these hills. They could not understand that hunger makes monsters of necessity, and silence makes prisoners of women. The whispers say he was not a gentleman. He worked the land with a ferocity that left his hands gnarled, and his temper shorter than the days of winter. She bore his weight, night after night, with a stillness that only the desperate know. And soon she bore his children. The first did not live past infancy, its body too small, its cries too weak, the shallow breath fading within weeks. The second survived, but neighbors began to notice the shape of the child's face, the way its eyes failed to align, the subtle distortions that made them glance quickly away. Nobody spoke of it openly. To do so would have been an accusation, a trespass into the private shame of another's bloodline. So they said nothing, but they remembered. By the time her third husband entered the picture, the cycle had already consumed her. He was not an outsider, he was not even distant. He was her cousin's brother, another man from the same family tree, so close in blood that even the most forgiving preacher would not dare join their hands in ceremony. Yet no preacher was needed. In the shadow of poverty, vows were unnecessary. He came to her bed as though it were his right, and she did not resist. By then, resistance was a luxury she could no longer afford. The children that followed bore the unmistakable weight of generations pressed too tightly together, sloping foreheads, fragile bones, jaws that did not fit their skulls. Some neighbors called them touched, others called them cursed. But she carried them all the same, raising each one with a weary tenderness that can only come from someone who knows her offspring are marked by her choices, by her family, by the relentless grip of the mountains themselves. It is said she did not smile often. Her beauty, once noted by passing eyes, had drained from her face, leaving only the hardened mask of endurance. To the outside world, she was simply a woman with too many children and too little joy. But within her home, within that darkened room where the bed creaked with the weight of kin, she was something else entirely. A gatekeeper of blood, a vessel of a lineage that would never escape itself. And through her, an entire family line became both preserved and destroyed at once. By the time the third husband claimed her, the woman was less a bride than a vessel carrying not love but lineage. 3 men, all bound by the same root, had lain in the same bed, and the children born of those unions began to carry the visible scars of what had been done. In the hollers, people looked at them with a mix of pity and dread. Some turned away, muttering prayers under their breath, while others whispered behind closed doors, asking how long blood could fold in on itself before it collapsed entirely. The children became living reminders of choices that no one dared put into words. At school, when they were sent at all, they were ridiculed in hushed tones, marked as different before they even opened their mouths. Teachers wrote notes in margins that never left the desk drawers, slow, impaired, sickly, and yet the family kept growing, as though the very cycle could not be stopped. Babies were born and buried, sometimes within the same season, little graves marked only by rocks in overgrown fields. Those who survived bore the family's curse in their faces, their voices, their minds. For the woman, there was no escape. By then she had become a figure both feared and pitied. The men in her life were not kings of their land, but shadows of it, men too poor to rise above their blood, too bound by need to look beyond the next meal. In them, she found no savior, and in herself, perhaps, no strength to resist. Survival in Appalachia was not about choice, it was about what could be endured. What makes her story so haunting is not simply that she lay with kin, but that generations were shaped in silence because of it. Entire branches of her family tree bent under the weight of her unions, and the echoes of that bed stretched into children's children, each one carrying forward the shadow of what had been done in that darkened room. It was as if the land itself had conspired to keep the cycle unbroken, the mountains rising up to trap her in their folds, the dirt swallowing any hope of her story reaching the light. And yet, it did not vanish completely. Fragments remain, scattered like bones across courthouse records, whispered by descendants too ashamed to claim them, muttered in warnings to children not to marry too close, not to repeat what their great-grandmother had done. But the truth is, the repetition had already begun. Once blood learns to feed on itself, the hunger is rarely satisfied in a single generation. The family line stumbled forward, marked forever by one woman, 3 husbands, and a bed that became a grave of inheritance. The echoes of her bed stretched far beyond her lifetime, lingering in the children who carried her blood like a curse stitched into their very skin. Some grew to adulthood, though their bodies betrayed them, stooped backs, twisted features, minds that never fully ripened. They lived at the edges of the community, tolerated but never embraced, whispered about as if their very presence might spread something unseen. Appalachia has long been a land of superstition, and her children became omens. If they appeared at your door, people believed misfortune would soon follow. If you married into their line, you did so knowing that whispers of shame would follow your name for decades. Yet, in the cruelest way, life went on. Those children, marked though they were, found partners of their own. Often those partners were once again cousins, neighbors bound by the same cycles of poverty and isolation that had trapped their mother before them. The bed she had shared with her 3 husbands became not an anomaly, but a blueprint, a generational echo, a map of sin carved so deeply into the family tree that it could not be erased, only repeated. This is where the true horror lies, not in one woman's choice, but in the way her lack of choice rippled outward, sealing the fate of those who came after. Children were born who never asked for such beginnings. They bore the weight of stares, the cruelty of laughter, the rejection of a society that claimed to be righteous, yet turned its back when help was needed most. Doctors rarely visited these horrors, and when they did, they carried judgments heavier than medicine. Teachers looked at the children and quietly marked them down as hopeless, unteachable, cursed. The system abandoned them, and so the family became both prison and tomb. And still the story endured, handed down in whispers, in half-truths, in warnings never spoken aloud in chew. Arch but always muttered at the dinner table. The woman's name faded from memory, as if even her descendants feared invoking it might invite her curse. But her legacy remained carved into faces, into crooked smiles, into the bones of those who bore her blood. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you carry the shame in silence, or would you cut yourself free, even if it meant severing every tie you had left? Generations passed, but the shadow of her bed never lifted. In family photographs, those rare, faded portraits taken by traveling photographers, you can see the trace of it. Children lined up in hand-me-down clothes, their eyes staring just past the lens, unfocused, uneven, carrying the unmistakable stamp of too much sameness in their blood. The adults stood stiffly behind them, their faces hardened, as if daring anyone to ask the questions they themselves could not answer. These photographs were not meant to be proud records. They were warnings etched in silver and paper, proof of what happens when blood folds in on itself too many times. The neighbors never forgot. Even as time moved on and roads began to carve their way deeper into Appalachia, the family remained a subject of whispered caution. Mothers told their daughters not to go near that side of the ridge. Boys laughed nervously when one of the girls from the cursed family showed up at church socials, daring each other to speak to her, but never doing so. The isolation that had birthed the cycle became the punishment that prolonged it. Those who carried her blood found themselves locked out of the very community they depended on for survival. Some tried to leave, a few packed what little they had and walked the long miles to coal towns, hoping anonymity might wash their blood clean. But even there, escape was an illusion. Their names followed them, carried in whispers by others who'd left the hills, and their bodies carried the truth in every feature. No matter where they went, they were marked. It is here, in the quiet persistence of that curse, that the true horror settles. The woman who lay in that bed is long dead. Her body returned to the soil she could never escape, but her choices, or perhaps her lack of them, were not buried with her. They live on in the descendants who still walk those mountains, who still bear the weight of something they never asked for. Her legacy is a haunting reminder that sins of survival do not die with the sinner. They cling, they fester, they root themselves in the marrow of generations until the blood itself becomes the prison. And so Appalachia keeps its silence. The story is told only in fragments, passed down by those who claim not to believe it, yet cannot resist the urge to repeat it. They say her name is gone, but her ghost lingers in the eyes of children still born in those hills, eyes that carry the weight of 3 husbands, 1 woman, and the most inbred bed Appalachia ever buried. And now, at the end of this story, we return to the silence of the mountains. The woman is gone, her 3 husbands gone with her, their bones long since swallowed by the soil. But the bed they shared never truly vanished. It became a symbol, a whispered legend, a scar carved into the memory of Appalachia. People do not speak her name, but they speak her curse. They point to her descendants as though they are shadows of something unspeakable, relics of a past too shameful to confront, too dangerous to forget. It is tempting to look at her as the architect of her own doom, to say she chose, that she allowed, that she birthed the curse herself. But the truth is heavier and darker. In those mountains, in those years, women were not granted choice. Their lives were spent serving men, serving hunger, serving bloodlines that swallowed them whole. What she endured was not love, but survival, and in surviving she became both victim and vessel. The tragedy is not hers alone, it belongs to every hand that pushed her into that bed, every silence that allowed it, every neighbor who looked away rather than intervene. The family that came after her bore the mark of those choices. Children twisted by genetics, minds dulled by blood too closely bound, bodies broken before their time. And yet, within those children was also the innocence of the condemned. They never asked for the curse, they never chose it, they were simply born into it, carrying a burden they could not set down. This is the true horror of inheritance. Not wealth, not land, not legacy, but blood that binds like chains. And so her story remains, tucked into the folds of forgotten Appalachia, where poverty breeds silence and silence breeds sin. A woman who lived, suffered and died in obscurity, yet left behind an echo strong enough to outlive her name. 1 woman, 3 husbands, 1 bed. A story that was never meant to be told, but once heard, can never be forgotten. Because in the end, Appalachia is full of graves without markers, of families who bury not only their dead, but their shame. And if you walk far enough into those hills, past the moss and the quiet, you might find yourself standing where her house once stood, where her bed once creaked beneath the weight of her bloodline. And if you listen closely, you may still hear it, the sound of a woman breathing in the dark, caught between survival and damnation.